Hey folks, Crazy Climber 80 here again. And before we get to game number 1 in R20 from the Colecovision series, I wanted to take a look at my honorable mentions list, games to avoid, and perhaps certain ugly things about the Colecovision. And in order, we'll look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. Of the Colecovision. So we'll start with the good, the games that didn't quite make the 20 from cut, but they're still worth checking out, or they're not too bad. Let's start with Turbo. The original arcade game was by Sega in 1981, and this is a decent port of the arcade classic. It's got a slightly annoying engine hum to it, but it's otherwise pretty faithful. And next we're going to look at Omega Race, very cool arcade port of the 81 Bally Midway classic. This has color, and there's a very cool option where you can just bounce off the floor and ceiling while facing a different direction, and you'll just repeatedly bounce back and forth. And that makes it much easier to deal with the enemies. And now let's look at Tutankhamun. This is a good port of the Konami original. It's got some different sound effects. Some of the sound effects are the same. Some kind of different looking enemies, but it plays very, very well. And you get to pick up right where you died, unlike in the arcade, the original by Konami in '82. And now let's look at Gorf. This is a very good port, but it's missing the Galaxians stage. It's still very good. It's got these stages that you'll remember from the arcade. And of course the flagship, and you can shoot its shots in this game. And now let's look at Galaxian. This is a wonderful port. It's a little bit tougher, I think, than you might think. The green enemies are a little faster than in the arcade. Very good port, though. And now let's look at Up and Down. This is a good port of the 3/4 perspective Sega Classic, with very forgiving hit detection. But the action is very much the same. And now let's look at Cabbage Patch Kids Adventures in the Park. This is kind of a cool little pitfall type of game. Just face screen after screen of obstacles. A popular toy line in the 80s. Ugly, ugly dolls, though. And now let's look at Smurf Rescue in Gargamel's Castle. This got updated graphics from the Atari 2600 version. It's graphically superior, and it's got some different scenes. There's a Smurfette that you gotta rescue. It's okay. I like the Atari 2600 port a lot. And now let's look at Bump and Jump, and this is a very, very good port. This has great music. It's maybe easier to crash enemy cars than possibly the arcade or the in television. But good port. And now we'll look at Popeye. The graphics aren't great, but the action is very good. And it's got all 3 stages that were in the arcade game. There's Popeye having eaten his spinach and gone radioactive or something. See, this is the 2nd stage. And then there's the 3rd stage, the ship. Pretty good. And now let's look at Oil's Well. And this is a lot like the arcade game Anteater. But it's very playable. Very similar. Don't want to let enemies touch your tail or your trail. And now let's look at Star Wars, the arcade game. It's got not nearly as good music as the arcade game or the voices from the arcade game, but it's playable. Yeah, there's not much music in this game, but it's still okay. And now let's look at MOONSWEEPER by Imagic. And it's kind of a fun little game. You avoid enemies in space, and you can land on moons and rescue miners. Like the scrolling graphics. And now let's look at Miner 2049er. This is a classic computer game. You paint all the floors by walking on them, and you avoid enemies, and you can collect energizers to turn the tables on the enemies. Now let's look at War Games. This is kind of a cool little Cold War game, loosely based on the movie. It's got some missile command elements to it. Kind of cool. I think a number of Colecovision enthusiasts liked this game. Not many good non-arcade ports for the system, but that might be one of them. Antarctic Adventure. This is a cute Konami. It's almost like a downhill skiing type of game. You control a penguin and you gotta jump over holes in the ice. You can collect fish for extra points. And eventually, you want to reach a fortress, or a fort, before the time runs out. And there's that fort. In Australia? It's kind of cold for Australia. Well, now let's look at Montezuma's Revenge, and this is another computer classic. You avoid traps and enemies, collect keys, open doors, etc. Lot of different rooms. This is pretty faithfully done. Not much in the way of music, but you don't really need it. It's definitely playable. Now let's look at BC's Quest for Tires. This is a funny game based on the Johnny Hart comic strip. It's a lot like Moon Patrol, in which you got to jump over obstacles or holes in the ground. But it's got some good humor. Various characters from the comic strip. But now let's look at Hero. And this is graphically superior to the Atari 2600 classic. Bomb walls, zap enemies, and rescue miners. Some souped up graphics. It still plays great. Now let's look at Jungle Hunt. This is a very good Taito arcade port with all 4 stages from the arcade game. This is probably the weakest segment here, killing the alligators. But yeah, it's got all 4 different stages. And now let's look at Monkey Academy, and this is a cute Konami math game. Great music. Cute gameplay. You make a monkey jump up and pull down slides, and you try to get them to be the missing number in a mathematical equation. Very, very cute. Completed the mathematical equation, and they celebrate. And now let's look at Pitfall 2. It's not a whole lot better than the Atari 2600 version, but it's still very fun. It's got very, very similar music and sound effects and stuff. And the save points in case you get killed. And now let's look at Q*bert's Cubes. This is the sequel to Q*bert. You hop on these 3D cubes to make them face the same way in a line to complete a level. watch out for enemies, and you can, if they hop on a cube that you just turned, they'll fall to their death. Kinda cool. Now let's look at the bad games. And there are a lot of them. Let's start with Dance Fantasy. And in this game, you just create a series of dance moves to really awful music. And the dance moves are played back to you in sequence. Just really sucks. Bad graphics, bad music. Ugh. Horrible. Now let's look at Face Maker. And this is simply a game where you just create a face and play it back with minimal movement. Just really some dull ideas. So you can choose from lips, nose, eyes, etc., ears, and then make them move slightly. Make the eyes blink or cry or make the mouth smile or ears wiggle or something. Really stupid. Ugh. Then we have Chuck Norris Super Kicks. And Chuck should be embarrassed for being in this game. You just walk along a path until you are attacked by two guys. And they can throw shurikens, I guess, or maybe it's a knife, and do some kind of clumsy looking jumps and kicks. And next is It's Only Rock and Roll, and this is kind of a virtual build your own rock band game. Sounds cool, but it's not. You get wealth, status, popularity, gigs, etc. But it's really not very good, and the music is horrible. Ugh. It's almost like, what's that game, Magic Bus or something? Just horrible music. Some prototype game for, I think, the Genesis or something, called Magic Bus or something. It was awful. And now this is a Campaign 84. It's a silly but awful game where you campaign to be president of the U.S. And there's like a really dumb Pac-Man type of game where you eat the U.S. flag or something. It's just really clumsy. They're trying to be silly and funny, and it just doesn't work. It's just a lot of bad games for the ColecoVision. I mean, almost every arcade port is great, but outside of that, there's a lot of awful games. Yeah, this is awful. And now let's look at One-on-One. And this is a one-on-one duel game of basketball with Dr. J and Larry Bird. And a lot of these games in the bad category look like they were on an Atari 2600. And, you know, for the ColecoVision, for the games that we've seen put out on that system, this is unacceptable. Just awful. And now let's look at a game called Slurpee. Yep. What a horrible title. But you just, you suck up enemies. That seems to be the general gameplay. Just, wow. What were they thinking? There were a lot of bad games, and a lot of them were made by the companies XONOX, Fisher-Price, Sunrise, Telegames, and Spinnaker. If you see a game that's made by one of those companies, it's best to stay the hell away from it. And now let's look at Aquatac. And this is a rather blah multi-stage game. You use a motorboat and a hang glider, and you travel certain distances and shoot enemies. It's just not very good. It just seems like a lot of these games just have an Atari 2600 feel to them. It's like the programmers just didn't give much of a shit. Get it, Colecovision? Just mostly stick to arcade ports, really. Now let's look at Alphabet Zoo. And this is a crummy educational game where you pick up letters in a maze to spell a word or the first letter of a word. See, that's seahorse, and you have to collect the S's. Lame. Now let's look at Amazing BUMPMAN. And you move white numbers into place by bumping the screen edge. Really lame-o. Kinda has the feeling of a weird old arcade game called Cram. And now let's look at a game called Artillery Duel. And it's a dull old computer game with tanks taking turns firing one shot at each other. And you determine distance, wind, amount of powder that you fire into your cannon shot. It's really lame. And now let's look at Brain Strainers, and there's two games. One of them is a Simon game. Are you kidding? They made a video game of this. Why? Match musical notes to follow the leader, and then there's also a game called CLEF Climber. Match musical notes. More like eardrum strainers. Dear God, what a crappy game. At any rate, now let's look at Cosmic Crisis, and this is a straight-up Space Panic rip-off. I mean, I guess it's not a bad game outside of being a blatant rip-off, or it's not horrible, but it's playable, but eh. Now let's look at Dr. Seuss's Fix Up the Mix-Up Puzzler, and this is just a slide puzzle. That is all it is, and it has Dr. Seuss characters. I guess the music could be worse, but that's all it is. It's a slide puzzle game. Just dumb idea for a game. But now let's look at the Dukes of HAZZARD. Cult show from late 70s, but bad game. It's got bad sprite scaling and a first-person perspective driving game. Just very clunky looking. Maybe a little too ambitious for its time, I don't know. Now let's look at Fraction Fever. You have this pogo stick rider land on pictures that match fractions so he can scale floors. Annoying sound effects. See, it says 2/6, and you want to select the two colored blocks out of 6. Make him land on that so that he can go up one level. Yeah. Now let's look at Gust Buster. And here you deflate or inflate balloons and fly over an amusement park. Might bring to mind the later Balloon Kid for the Game Boy, which was actually an okay game. This isn't really. There'll be explosions on occasion, and you need to touch down at certain places, I guess. Skip it. Ugh. Now let's look at a game called Illusions, and some people kind of like this, I guess. There's an MC Escher type of setting, not here. There's also a 3D cube. It's got kind of okay music. And I guess what you do is you try to merge these hopping critters. I'm not entirely sure about the gameplay. And here's the MC Escher building. I'm not entirely sure what to do in this game. It doesn't look that interesting to me. Now let's look at James Bond 007. Cool movie franchise, bad game. This is kind of a Scramble ripoff, where there's Bond's car and water vehicle shooting enemies. And that's really all it is. really sad that it has the James Bond name attached to it. Now let's look at Jukebox. Here I guess you hop from square to square with footprints or something, and you try to create gold records using memory and concentration, and you try to beat the other player. That's probably the best part of the game, is those dancing devils. Now let's look at Learning with LEEPER. And this is 4 games. One of them is a maze game, and one of them is like a number match, one of them is a picture match, and one of them is painting a picture. And they're all incredibly dull and uninteresting. And I guess that creature is LEEPER. Ugh. Yeah, you just try to determine the number match, how many dogs there are and how many bones you have to give, and then you can paint pictures there, and then you just try to match letters or pictures or something here. Blech. Now let's look at linking logic. And here you place items on floors to guide a child to safety. And while the child's on that platform, you get to choose where to place these things, like springboards or parts of the floor to fill in so that they walk safely over it. Really dull. Sorry about that there. Now let's look at logic levels. This is kind of the same game as linking logic, but you guide a ball to hit prizes after you've placed floor pieces or springboards or whatever. And you can pull floorboards away. And now let's look at Memory Manor. This is a memory game kind of like Concentration, and it has window washing in it too. Here a chopper will put your guy in place on one of the floors, and yeah, you wash those windows, and you can try to match pictures or numbers or whatever. Not a very good game. And now let's look at Motocross Racer. And this is a rather blah bike racing game through desert, woods, and beach. Really uninspired graphics. Very, very dull. And let's also look at Mountain King. And you collect diamonds to get a flame spirit. Then you get a crown and escape. At least it has the classic In the Hall of the Mountain King music. You have a flashlight, I guess. There it is. And now let's look at Robin Hood. You use arrows or a sword, I guess, to kill henchmen of the Sheriff of Nottingham, and eventually rescue Maid Marian in a castle. And you can easily get killed. It's a horrible game. Now, most of these really bad games I'd never heard of until just recently. And now let's look at Rolloverture. And here you guide notes via levers, moving levers and conveyor belts, etc., to their correct place in the overture. For the great arcade conversions that we've seen on the Colecovision, You'd think that there would be better graphics in some of these other games, but they're terrible. More like early Atari 2600. Ugh. Now let's look at Sammy Lightfoot. And this is a rather crappy game where you use trampolines, swings, etc. to cross hazards. Just, yeah. This is just one stage here. The stages will get progressively difficult. Yeah, it doesn't interest me too much. And now let's look at a game called Sector Alpha. Here you destroy enemies, shoot or avoid missiles in a first-person perspective shooter with very annoying sound effects. Ugh, no thanks. Now let's look at a game called Sir Lancelot. And you play as Sir Lancelot riding Pegasus? Fricking really? What the hell? And you jab the enemies with your lance. And later on you try to kill a dragon. And I guess that's Maid Marian at the bottom. Gotta jab your lance in its throat or its body or something. Who dreamed up this crap? Well, now let's look at skiing. And this is extremely dull. You can play downhill or slalom events. But it's really awful graphics. Really awful movement. Just sucks. Well, now let's look at a game called Spectron. And this is a really dull Galaxian knockoff. But there is at least a couple wide protective barriers there to protect you from enemy shots. It's not a good game. Like an Atari 2600 game. And now we're going to look at Squish'em Sam, and this actually had voice samples. Only 2 games for the ColecoVision had voice samples. This is like Crazy Climber, but you can hang from the floors and stomp on critters, and the game says, squish 'em! And you just try to get to the top. Money, money, money! What? Yeah. Craptastic. Now let's look at Sub-Rock, and this was an arcade release by Sega back in the day, and it wasn't very good. And I don't know why they bothered with a ColecoVision port. First-person perspective shooter on the sea where you can fire in the air or shoot torpedoes. Blech. And now let's look at Super Action Soccer. And this was for the Super Action controller, which was a convoluted mess. It's bad graphics with some close-up scenes when you get near the goal or when you try to stop a shot. And now let's look at Super Cobra, and this is a rare, awful arcade port. You seem to have really heavy bombs that drop ridiculously fast and at a weird angle. Very, very bad arcade port. I'm really, really disappointed with this one. Yeah, definitely avoid this. It's terrible. Now let's look at Super Cross Force, and you control the top and bottom ships. They fire simultaneously at enemies. Really awful idea. What in the hell? For the ColecoVision, this is completely unacceptable. Just stay away from this crappy game. Now let's look at a game called Telly Turtle. This is an extremely limited doodle game. You just draw lines. You can change the angle of your lines. Just really uninteresting. Blah, skip it. Now let's look at Threshold. And this is an Astro Blaster ripoff. And not a good one. It's got crappy sound effects. You can move up and down all around the playfield, though. There's the docking stage, just like an Astro Blaster. Thanks, Ma. Well, that's kind of funny. But the game is absolute straight-up crap. Now let's look at Tomark the Barbarian. And you can switch between the Barbarian and a girl named Senta, and try to either get a mystical sword or get the Senta girl to safety when needed. What's with those jumping mechanics? What the... What? Is he a flea? Jeez Louise. Stupid. What? Well, now let's look at Tournament Tennis, and this is a really bad tennis game with poor graphics. Very poor graphics. This is by Magic, who's definitely done a lot better than this. Just not very good. And now let's look at a game called Word Feud, and this is just a word search. Why did they make a game of this? Go get a friggin' newspaper instead, or a word search book. Good God. That's our bad games, and now let's look at the ugly side of the ColecoVision. There was some games with very choppy movement, or choppy scrolling, and this is Time Pilot. It's really kind of a disappointment, I think. Also, the Coleco Atom. Boy, it had so much potential, and it failed so miserably. It was expensive to produce, expensive to purchase, and there was just so many errors with the system. Cost the company a lot of money, and the general failure of non-arcade games was really disappointing for the ColecoVision. And something that was also disappointing was how convoluted the Super Action controllers were. Ugh! 4 triggers, friggin' 12-button keypad, a thumb roller controller, and the joystick all to have to worry about? No thanks! Gads. And the sports games that they were to play with sucked too. Like Super Action Soccer, Super Action Baseball. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't good. Same as Super Action Football. Just disappointing that there weren't better sports games. And Tournament Tennis. And skiing. Yeah, there should have been better sports games for the ColecoVision. And that knob on the ColecoVision controller was crappy. What the heck? Just the little stubby thing, just hard to control, and the keypad to worry about too. And games that I did not mention, I felt were kind of meh, kind of okay, or not great, but not horrible, kind of in between. One thing I want to mention is happy birthday, or happy slightly belated birthday, to Anthony Durso, who created the Neo Geo forums for Atari Age website. Happy belated birthday, buddy. Well, that was my look at the good, bad, and ugly of the ColecoVision. Thank you for watching, and when we return, we will look at my 20 from ColecoVision series game number 1. Hope you join me for that. Hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.